Welcome everybody. It's World Wetlands Day, so thanks for coming to celebrate with us. If you are new to Save the Sound, or if you don't know a lot about it, Save the Sound leads environmental action in your region. We fight climate change, save endangered lands, protect the Sound and its rivers, and work with nature to restore ecosystems. And we do this through a lot of different ways. We do it through legislative advocacy and legal action, engineering, environmental monitoring, and hands-on volunteer efforts, which is a lot of our ecological restoration work. So you might hear about some of that today. And together we restore and protect all that impacts the Long Island Sound region's environment, from the rivers and shorelines to wetlands and forests, and from the air we breathe to the waters of the Sound itself. We've been doing this for over 40 years, ensuring people and wildlife can enjoy the healthy, clean, and thriving environment they deserve today and for generations to come. And as I'm sure you're all aware, as a nonprofit, we rely on our generous supporters like you to make all of this work possible. So if you like what you hear today, if you want to keep supporting our work, it would be really great if you could make a donation at savethesound.org/donate. We really appreciate it. All of your donations go straight to your local environment. We use it to get working. So I hope everyone had a chance to watch the short documentary. If you didn't, it's okay. We're probably going to be touching on a bunch of different topics that you will enjoy anyway. But without further ado, I'm going to introduce the panelists so that we can dive into it. First, we have Elsa. Elsa joins us from across the country in Washington State. She's the Senior Director of Restoration and Administration with Restore America's Estuaries, and she manages Restore America's Estuaries National Restoration Program and oversees the planning and logistics of the National Summit. She's also geographically very close to the Snohomish Estuary, so she's going to bring us that interesting local perspective to the conversation. Next, we have Anthony. Anthony is our Assistant Director of Ecological Restoration at Save the Sound. In his role, he works to push our critical hands-on restoration work forward with strategic approaches to the communications, operations, and collaborations and funding of our ecological restoration team. Last but not least, we have Bill Lucey, who a lot of you might know. He's our Long Island Soundkeeper at Save the Sound. And when he's not out on the water doing water quality tests and monitoring for sewage spills, he's at the Capitol advocating for the fish, wildlife, and communities of the Sound. Bill wears a lot of different hats, so you've probably seen him in other presentations if you've been in them. But like I said, without further ado, I think we're going to kick it off. So first, we're going to have our panelists kind of talk about their largest takeaways from the film. And Elsa, if you want to start us there.
All right. Hello, everybody. I'd say good morning, but I guess it's good afternoon for you folks out on the East Coast. So I hope you enjoyed the film. And one of my big takeaways is with the Snohomish Estuary. I don't know if you guys are familiar with where that is, but to give you a little context, the Snohomish Estuary is north of Seattle. And if you've heard of Everett, it's right kind of in the middle of Everett, Marysville. So just about 45 minutes north of Seattle. And it's one of the second largest watersheds in the Puget Sound, covering nearly 2,000 square miles. But it is right there in the middle of the city. So if you saw the film, you saw that shot where they showed the freeway and then they panned over, and the restoration project is going along right there next to the freeway. So there are, people commute right through it, and they can look over and see the restoration going on, see the estuary right there. People live there, people, recreate there. It's incredibly urban, and it's also a really important watershed. There's 8 species, salmonid species, that call that estuary home. Salmon are very important to our ecosystem out here, for obvious reasons, but a lot of what we talk about, those charismatic megafauna, people love the whales, right? Salmon eat the whales, so that's always a great connection we can make for people. But that estuary is really important because the threatened Chinook salmon, which is a favorite of the whales, lives there. It's an important home for the salmon. But it is just, there's so much development going on around there. And one of the main things that's threatening the salmon is loss of habitat. And so bringing that estuary and that habitat back is really important. So I just love that shot, because I think it's just such a great image where you see that very, very busy freeway and then pans over and you see the restoration. but also that great connection when we talk about blue carbon. All these cars, going by, emitting carbon, and then here's a way that we can really work to trap that carbon in those, and healthy estuaries are a great way to do that.
Grateful to have Elsa here, bringing that local view and that local experience of what you just saw, in the video is always really, really nice and special when we can have that kind of perspective. For me and from the perspective of our ecological restoration work, this is it's a systems story, and it's a story about the uniqueness of these places called estuaries. And we're extraordinarily fortunate to live on a nationally significant estuary, and here with Long Island Sound, and all of the various benefits that accrue from that. There was a quote from the film that stood out to me. It's right near the beginning. It said the marine water wants to bring in the resources that it has. The fresh water wants to bring down what it's created. And when they mix, it's in that brackish area where things thrive and die and create new life. And that is just a very eloquent and concise way of describing the critical importance of our wetlands and these estuarine areas. So within Long Island Sound, obviously all of Long Island Sound itself is an estuary, but then within that we have all of the various rivers and watersheds that are emptying into the Sound. They have their own exchanges, and these areas of exchange are among the most abundant, also among the most fragile and complex ecosystems that we have. So they require special attention, and they also are worthy of all the attention that we can give them as restoration practitioners. So that was probably the biggest takeaway for me, is just that this was a really concise, eloquent depiction of the importance, and also the really complex network of impact that can come from engaging with these areas.
So what struck me about the movie was the excavator scene when they showed that causeway that was cutting across an arm, one of the tidal arms of the estuary, and they dug that out. Maybe there were some undersized culverts, and at Save the Sound we do some of this work. And then they had the sped up imagery where it was obvious how the system was responding to getting rid of that pinch point. And so you just see the whole ocean flooding in across this naturally vegetated area. All the carbon's getting sucked out. It's bringing in salt water. It's pulling back out again, forward and back. It's almost like it's breathing. It's alive. And I like to describe estuaries as the battery packs to the ocean. And if you look at Long Island Sound, we have over 100 bays and harbors. Those are the mini estuaries to the larger estuary, which is Long Island Sound. So I look at those as just energy sources all around, because that's that face where the fresh and the salt meet, and it creates those salt wedges and turbulence. That's where all the nutrients get churned up. That's where a lot of the nitrogen gets processed. That's where a lot of the carbon is made available. And that's where all these nursery fish and shrimp and crab, especially when they're small, because they're protected areas, and they can bathe in this nutrient-rich protected area in a healthy estuary that has all kinds of nooks and crannies for the little guys to hide in. So that's why I was pleased to talk on this board, and especially with Elsa, since this is what she does for a living, is go to these special places and direct funding and teach people how to fix them, because we're losing them at an incredibly fast rate. And we really need to push back against that. And we'll hear a little bit more about why they're so important. Thank you.
And to follow up with Bill, he was talking about that restoration project where you're seeing the excavators breaking away that dike. And one of the things with the Snohomish Estuary is back in the 1860s was when diking started for farmland. And so a lot of places, I think they say about 90% of pre-settlement estuaries have been diked and drained, and now have lost that connectivity from the tidal flow. And so that project that you saw in the video is the Quileute Estuary Restoration Project, and that is led by the Tulalip tribe. And the quote that Anthony quoted was at the beginning. That was one of the Tulalip tribal elders who was speaking. And so in that project, it was back in 2015, and they removed 1,400 feet of dike and opened that up. And what used to be farmland, which had gone fallow, they weren't farming it anymore, that brought back about 350 acres of tidal habitat. And then you also saw later in the film the folks who were staining for the salmon, and they're now have seen that 2015 was over 5 years ago now. They're seeing that salmon are coming back. They're using that space, and that is so critical, because when you know the salmon life cycle, salmon are born upriver, come down and go out into the sea, but they can't just go straight from the rivers to the sea. They really need time in those tidal estuaries to kind of go into those back channels where the water is slow, it's shallow, so they can hide from birds and other predators, and they can grow and feed and get bigger before they go out into the ocean, and then they have a much greater chance of survival that way. And so when all that when the dikes were preventing them from doing that, they were just kind of getting flushed out into the saltwater with no hope of survival, and that was really detrimental to the survival of the salmon. So opening that up, that one project, like I said, opened 350 acres, and I think to date in the Snohomish watershed, there's been more than 1,300 acres that has been opened up and restored. So we're making progress, but again, that's the beauty of these films, is the visualization to speed up that project and watch the excavators open it up. And like Bill said, you can watch it breathe. I mean, that's just so incredible and such a great visualization.
I want to add one thing to that story about the West Coast deltas where those dikes are. There's a professor, Dr. Montgomery, who wrote a book called The King of Fish. And he goes through salmon extinction starting way back in Scotland when they had keepers, not a Soundkeeper, but a salmon keepers. That's one of the terms that generated the whole keeper movement. And they told people when they could fish and when they couldn't. And they slowly started adding dams, and a new king would come in and say, okay, after this round of dams, no more dams. And then time would go by, they'd build a few more. Pretty much the salmon are farmed over there now. There's still a few wild ones. But what really is irritating about the West Coast is those dikes are subsidized by you as taxpayers. Those farmers, no offense to the farmers, but we are actually paying for maintenance, the Army Corps and others, to maintain a lot of those dikes, where Dr. Montgomery says, if you just got rid of the subsidies, you'd save taxpayer money. The dikes would all blow out because they're not being artificially subsidized. You increase Chinook, king salmon, that critical period, as Elsa said, the 6 months between when they leave the river into the estuary and then go out to sea, that determines how well they're going to do in life and whether they come back as an adult. It would increase it by 80%. So Elsa's group, Ray, is doing a great job of intentionally finding areas which aren't controversial. But as taxpayers, if you just stopped subsidizing these areas, you would fix a massive amount of habitat after one big winter flood storm. So I just throw that out there for a scale.
Yeah, they've been finding that some of the dikes out here where they're starting to fail and flooding is happening, and they're actually finding that it is cheaper in areas where they can to just let them go, open them up, and not have to pay to maintain them. And so there are some areas where dikes are failing, and they're just kind of letting them fail. And so that's when that can be an option. It can be less costly in the long run.
Awesome. Thanks, guys, for your initial takeaways. That was a lovely intro discussion. I think I want to backpedal just a little bit with the first couple of questions, and just kind of like set the stage for everybody. So this film spoke about estuaries at its core and all of the different benefits they provide to our communities and just what makes them so special and unique. So I want to dive into that a little bit. Like I said, some stuff was mentioned in the film, but if we could just take a few minutes to talk about why estuaries, what are all the benefits they provide, what makes them so unique, why do we need estuaries in terms of everything else, just how do they fit in with the whole natural world, what makes them a standout, basically.
Oh man, there's, as the film said, so many benefits for estuaries, right? I mean, we talked about the habitat for salmon. The video touched on the blue carbon benefit of being able to trap carbon deep in the soils. And then tribes are a huge part of everything out here. And so just the cultural significance, they're really important. People get food, recreate, live around them, and then flood protection. And then they're so productive. And again, Anthony's what he quoted at the beginning of the nutrients coming down the river. So they're constantly changing. And the nutrients coming down from the rivers, and in the Snohomish, it starts way up in the Cascade Mountains. So all that nutrient-rich soils just come down the river, and then the estuary is just constantly changing. And then so it's this really kind of in the middle place where it's not fully river, it's not fully marine, constantly mixing, bringing in nutrients, and there's such a large gradient, and so it can be so diverse because so many different plants and animals can live there with the gradient of fresh to salt water and the changing tides and all of that. So it's just a really unique place.
Yeah, and what Elsa's referencing there is one of my favorite. I'm not a biologist, but this is one of my favorite terms from biology and ecology is edge effect, and thinking about these areas where multiple ecosystems overlap or bump up against one another. They tend to be not only the most diverse and rich in life, but also the most innovative in a way. And there's a lot happening with all these species sort of interacting in these different conditions, coming and going. And so there's a couple of things that result from that. One, I think, is that there's some very particular habitat that can exist there that can't exist anywhere else. So I think, in our area or our region, the most obvious example of this is a salt marsh sparrow, right? Which has been really threatened as we see rising sea levels in Long Island Sound and tidal flushing of sort of we're losing some of the lower marsh, and so these birds, they rely on a very precise schedule of flooding for their habitat. So when the tides go out, they go in and they build their nest and they lay their eggs, and the eggs hatch, and then the young birds have to get out by the time the next tidal cycle comes in. And we're just seeing that cycle has been changed by like a day or 2 days or whatever it is, and they're just not having quite enough time. So they're really particular, and they create a lot of really fascinating effects and diversity and innovation. So I love this concept of edge effects. I think it also applies to a lot of our communities and community building and team building and all of that. It's just one of the many, many things that we have to learn from nature, is the abundance and the benefit that can accrue from different areas or different ecosystems overlapping.
Awesome, thank you. So I think the film brings up that because of all of these benefits, a lot of major cities are built on and around estuaries. And when I first saw that in the film, my first gut reaction was, is that a good thing? Is that something we want to have happening? If obviously it provides a lot of benefits to communities, but the more communities that live on estuaries, the more you have to worry about pollution and human impact and all the different kinds of things like that. So I guess I was just wondering if any of you guys have any thoughts about that balance, if you guys had a initial same reaction, different reaction, and just your thoughts on that.
Well, Long Island Sound is called the Great Urban Sea, and there's millions of people close by it. So it's very impacted. I spend time out on the marshes. I go canoeing around, and they're in terrible shape because of development. One of them is because the ditching that happened for mosquito control in the 30s. I'm sure everybody's all aware of that. And that completely changes the ebb and flow of the water. It speeds it up. It causes erosion. And then, of course, we have the I-95 corridor, and we have the coal plants regenerating all this carbon locally. So I just want to back up really quick, Karina, and just make sure everybody is aware of what the carbon sink process is. So everyone says talk to your plants. Well, that's because they uptake carbon dioxide. So you have all this carbon dioxide coming down. And if you've ever walked around a healthy salt marsh, it's just going off. It grows really fast. It's an incredible annual growth. But the key is they have these big root systems that have evolved in order to handle the periodic king tides or storm surge. So they're evolved to hold on. So they put a lot of structure into their roots. And so as that carbon dioxide gets turned into the plant and goes down, it gets into the leaves and into the root structure. And then in the fall, everything dies, everything breaks down. But what is also happening is, since it's this flushing area, you get sediment deposits. And so in a naturally functioning system, and I mentioned dams before about Scotland, but Connecticut is the same issue. We have around 4,000 dams plus or minus several hundred more, and that's interrupted all this sediment flow. So you have these ditch wetlands, you have a dammed watershed that's because it's urbanized, is not doing the natural sediment cycling. And what's happening is the wetlands are unable to accrete. So they're not getting sediment to meet sea level rise. They're not getting the sediment to bury the leaves to increase the root depth. And all those leaves and roots are full of carbon. And when they're in that lower level of salt marsh, because it's all saturated with water and oxygen doesn't diffuse very fast through water, that's where the carbon's stored. That's why these wetlands are so incredibly robust at storing carbon, is because of that growing wetland, that accretion, the functioning watershed. So that's what urbanization does. It adds impervious cover. It adds more carbon dioxide through the transportation networks, all the planes flying over, all the energy, fossil fuel burning. So it's a really big challenge to try and turn that around. But I do think that with proper management, we have the technology to do it. It's just, it's a matter of groups like Ray and Save the Sound and others. We have a lot of partners working on this to really step up both dam removals and wetland restoration at the same time, especially in urban areas.
Yeah, and the human component is one that, you can't take it out of the equation. And when they're doing these restoration projects and removing the dikes, you have to look at what is around it. And with that project in the Snohomish, there was a sewage treatment plant over there. And so they couldn't just open the dike and just let it go completely back to the way it was pre-settlement. So they did have to put a setback dike, but they were able to move it back. So they were able to still, like I was saying, restore hundreds of acres, but they still had to keep in mind there were homes. There was a sewage treatment plant that you definitely didn't want to be inundated with salt water. There was the freeway. that's I-5, that freeway. And if you're familiar with the area, that's the freeway that goes from Canada to Mexico. So they definitely had to make sure that wasn't impacted. So you really have to take the human component into consideration when you're planning for these projects. But the flip side of that is there's a huge possibility for engagement, for education. These people are driving right through it, and and people are living there, so this is their backyard. And so I'm sure similar to you guys out there, where you're talking about your incredibly urban estuary, people live there. People have kind of a sense of place, and you can really capitalize on that and have people take a sense of ownership to that place. I mean, people who live in the Puget Sound, you just look, you can look 360 degrees and see water practically here. And so that's a great engagement opportunity to educate people, to get them really invested in restoring, in taking care of this resource that is all around them.
Yeah, I want to build on both of those. Sort of a perfect setup to some of the work that we do at Save the Sound, but in terms of dam removal, which Bill mentioned, and green infrastructure, which there's good nutrients and bad nutrients, and I think one of the things that our team does well is we monitor for pollutants that are in these embayments across Long Island Sound. That's our water quality team does that. And when we find an area where that's really burdened and failing some of these tests for water quality, we can figure out what might be contributing to that and address it, whether that's looking at the sewage treatment plants nearby, looking at impervious surface. When we do watershed planning efforts, that's really what we're looking at. We're looking at non-point sources of pollution, so runoff of these impervious surfaces, which is carrying these pollutants into the waterways and then eventually out to the sound. And from the perspective of the wetlands, it's not going to sort of distinguish between, these nutrients are exactly what I need and these aren't, so I'm just going to push that little bit of water that way and keep this water here. They're going to take it all, and we need to respect, not only for them but for all the species that use that, the fact that there's a huge human component in the health of these that relates to our everyday actions, and the way that we live, and the way that our communities and our development in our communities manages stormwater. So with things like green infrastructure solutions like that, we're really helping reduce the amount of pollutants that are making their way down. Dam removal, Bill mentioned that there's a really healthy sediment flow, and Elsa mentioned earlier nutrient flow, with particularly in the form of diadromous fish, right? So fish that fish that either spend their adult life in the sound or in brackish marine waters and then migrate into the rivers to spawn, or vice versa. That is a critical source of nutrient exchange, right? Where they're bringing nutrients from the Long Island Sound up into our rivers, and then when they travel back out, they're bringing freshwater ecosystem nutrients into these estuarial areas and into the Sound, and then into the ocean itself. So a lot of the work that we do has impact on these wetland areas, even if we're not directly working in the wetland area. And I think that was a huge message and takeaway from this film as well, is that whenever you're working with a natural system, right, you're doing one thing, but you're affecting a lot of other things. And it's going to be impossible for us to always understand everything that changes when we complete a project. But we do try and take a really holistic approach to understanding, and a careful approach to understanding what the impact might be. And that's almost always an argument for using nature-based solutions as opposed to gray solutions that, you know, like building a seawall that just redirects wave energy and that kind of thing to you know, restoring marshes or doing tidal reconnection projects like Elsa mentioned. So a lot of the work that we do on the restoration team, even if it's not directly in a wetland area, has a lot of impact on the ability of these ecosystems to thrive and survive.
Yeah, that connectivity thing is so critical to keep in mind. And one of the stories I like to tell is a river next to this one, the Skagit River, a little further north. We're working on a project that's a couple 100 miles upriver, and it is actually a killer whale restoration project. And it's so funny that we're 200 miles upriver. You know, a whale is not going to make it up there, but we're working on salmon habitat. We're building a side channel to the river, similar to what I was saying. So juvenile salmon can go into these side channels, kind of rest and grow and feed before they make the big trek downriver. And but we got funding for that project through a group that funds killer whale restoration. And so, yes, there is the connection. Even 200 miles all the way upstream, those salmon are going to eventually grow big enough, go down, and then feed the orcas. So it's all connected. And again, that's just a really great opportunity for education to, you know, teach the people who may live, you know, a couple 100 miles upriver, who have never, you know, who don't go down to the Puget Sound, that what they do to the river up there still affects, you know, things all the way miles, hundreds of miles downstream, and then eventually to the whales. So.
And I'll do one quick follow up with that. It's not just the killer whales; it's the commercial fishermen. For over 15 years, I was a commercial fisherman in Alaska, and much of that time I held a troll permit, either a power troll permit or a hand troll permit, and we fished for king salmon. And our area did produce some king salmon, but the majority of the king salmon produced in Southeast Alaska or harvested are from the Pacific Northwest, especially Washington. They've done a lot of tagging studies. So as the habitat was destroyed in Washington, our ability to catch those fish shrank. Our seasons got shorter, the quotas got smaller. And I can tell you, in a town that I lived in of 800 people, and we had the highest fishing permit per capita in the state. Everybody fished. Every family had a fisherman, and they relied on that, especially the winter kings. A lot of those fish that are benefiting from raised restoration 200 miles up the Skagit are going to swim by those guys' hooks out in Yakutat Bay someday. And in the winter, they're worth $10 a pound. So if you're in a tight economy and every king salmon you catch is $100, and you can go out and catch 5 fish trolling all day and direct market them because they're beautiful, the best salmon by far. So that's how the economy also gets linked into the ecology and to this whole restoration. We can't forget that human element. If the system is functioning, we all benefit.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. There are some questions coming through in the chat, so we're going to switch gears a little and jump into them. The first one is from John Sargent. It's a little long, so I'm going to read it, but it says, there is a U.S. government program through NOAA called the National Estuary, I don't know how to say that word, I apologize, Research Reserve System. There are currently 29 of these spread along the entire U.S. coastal range, and there's an application in process to create a CT NERS from Connecticut River to Mason's Island in Stonington. Do any of the panelists have thoughts on how these NERS can help protect and restore estuaries around the country, and especially in Connecticut?
I can answer that really quick. There's a bunch of meetings coming up that are public. And if you want to see the NERS focusing on wetland coastal marsh restoration as one of its duties, now's the time. If they get 50 comments from people during this public testimony, it says, hey, we want you focusing on techniques for restoring wetlands in this area. And they'll do things like there was a program funded last year through Sea Grant, which is looking at the genetics of the plants that wetland restorers are using. So to make sure if you're going to plant Spartina grass in a wetland restoration in one part of the Sound or over on Long Island or Westchester, you're using the right stock to increase your chances of success. So that kind of research really needs to happen in order to get the biggest bang for your buck. So I would say public comment. The NERS hopefully will be up out of the gate by about a year from now. And the ability of NERS to do research is incredible. If you go on, they maintain a national database, and anyone can go on and you can say, go to Coos Bay, Oregon, and download all the oxygen readings for 1995 to 1998, for whatever reason you might want to do that. But all that data is there. And we're going to have that capability in Long Island Sound. And the last thing I'll plug for that, which is a little off topic, John, but good question and good to see you, is that we are going to be buying those same instruments that the NERS use, that the Yukon, where it's going to be stationed, use, and we're going to have those in the Western Sound. So one of our comments for the NERS is to coordinate with outside the government agencies. So we are setting up our monitoring at Save the Sound the exact same way that the NERS will be doing it. And that way we'll have that data available for a broader audience. So I don't know if anyone else wants to comment on the NERS.
Yeah, I will. From the perspective of the restoration team, there's a few things that we're thinking about and would love to see happen through the NERD. Bill mentioned these are powerhouses for research and being able to sort of expand and also in a way standardize our understanding and our monitoring efforts in these places. So one of the things is just marsh restoration projects, monitoring those and trying to understand what's working and what isn't, and how fast things are rebounding or adapting. And the same thing with living shorelines projects. I know other NERDs have taken on a bunch of living shorelines projects. And for us here in Long Island Sound, with the rate of sea level rise, those living shorelines are going to be one of our best bets, and one of the practices we really need to understand and implement in all its various forms across the region. And understanding or having a place where we can implement some of those practices and then monitor their success during these storms to understand just how well they're protecting or working in concert with the wetlands to buffer communities and other ecosystems, and how well the inland ecosystems are holding up in these storms based on the success or failure of those living shorelines projects. And just briefly, living shorelines is a fairly broad term, essentially referencing nature-based resiliency offshore solutions that either disperse, absorb wave energy, or just use natural systems like oyster reefs or some combination of green and gray infrastructure to buffer that increased wave energy that we're seeing from a lot of these storms due to climate change.
And I'll just put in a plug too for just the research and monitoring, is kind of following up on what Anthony was saying. It's so critical, we do these restoration projects, but to have the data to back it up, to say whether or not they're successful. I mean, it's one thing to, remove a dike and watch the water come back, but are the salmon really using it? And so, like I mentioned in the film, you see the beach sanding where they are, monitoring the salmon to see how they're using it, are they using it? And then to be able to tell that great success story that yes, this worked, they did come back. And if this worked here, it can work in other places. And having that research and those data, when you go and try to inform policy, to then you take the next step to make changes, it's really critical to have that research to be able to back that up, to prove that it did work. So that's another just critical thing for research, monitoring, and all of that.
Great, thanks guys. And Bill put a link in the chat for the CT link for NERS. We're also going to circulate relevant links after the webinar, so you guys will get an email within a week after we end with some relevant links. So if you can't get that down, don't worry about it. You'll get it later. And for our next question, Barbara has been waiting very patiently. She raised her hand to ask a question, so I'm going to go ahead and unmute her and let her ask her question.
I was at a virtual international conference with the Dalai Lama and Greta. I don't know if anyone else saw it recently. And two scientists that work in the Arctic having to do with global warming and how fast the water, the ice in the tundra is melting. And it's much more rapid than anyone can imagine. And they're sending the alarm out to the world. But one of the main points, and it blew my mind, was how important wetlands restoration was in mitigating global warming. And that they really pushed how, I really love the idea of habitat and salmons and all of that, but we're trying to save the world right now. And all of these wetland my whole worldview about everything switched after that, because I understood the importance of wetland restorations and how it sucks up carbon faster than rainforests even. And I just want to emphasize that, because then after this very informative and interesting international discussion, they said, well, what can we do? How do we stop it? And they said, education, education, education. So the importance of blue carbon and the importance of wetlands restoration is, it's the top. And since I live on the Long Island Sound, and I'm now working on a wetlands restoration in City Island. We're trying to develop the thing is, this is what we have to help everyone understand. We can, send money to the Amazon but we have it in our backyard. We have to work right here, right now. So that's all I have to say.
All right, Barbara, you're hired. That was great. I'm glad we got that recorded. So now we can play that back. You're a great spokeswoman for the cause. But yeah, I mean, you make a great point, and I missed that that you referenced the conference or whatever you said. But sorry, I missed that. But I'm so excited to hear that they were stressing the importance of wetland restoration, and it's one of those things that people just instinctively know forests are important, rainforests are important, they absorb carbon. And I think that's just because we're land creatures, right? We walk amongst the trees, they're right there. And the wetlands, they're underwater. And so I think it's the plants you don't necessarily see. And so I think it's a little bit harder for people just to instinctively make that connection that wetland plants are also plants and do absorb carbon the same way that forests do. And they're more efficient at it. So they can capture carbon at rates 2 to 4 times greater on a per acre basis than forests. And then we were talking about how the nutrients come down and just the soils just build up in wetlands. And they can do that and bury the carbon 10 times greater rates, 10 times faster than forests. And so they are just so incredibly good at doing this. But like you said, people just don't really think about it. And wetlands currently contain about 20 to 30% of global soil carbon, yet they only occupy about 5% of its surface. So they're critically important, but when wetlands are degraded, they release that carbon. So all of that carbon that's been so efficiently and effectively stored, once wetlands are drained, once they're degraded, they start releasing that. So you lose all of the habitat benefits and all of the water quality benefits and all of the other things that we were talking about, and you're also releasing all this carbon into the atmosphere. So yeah, Barbara, I'm really glad you brought that around. And the thing is, I think with this is there's so many benefits to restoring wetlands that you can kind of tailor the message. And Bill was talking about, like, you know, if you're in front of a bunch of fishermen, maybe global warming, sea level rise, maybe that's not really forefront of their mind, and you can talk about the benefits of a habitat for fish. You know, if you're talking to people, like at that forum you went to, Barbara, that was about climate change, and then yes, you really got to drill home the importance of restoring wetlands for that. You know, or if you're talking about somebody who lives on the shoreline and they're just a property owner, you can talk about flood protection and how having a natural shoreline is actually in some areas going to protect you better than having that seawall. So there's so many benefits that you can kind of tailor your message to your audience, which I think, you know, is something to kind of keep in mind depending on who you're speaking to.
Elsa said it. I just want to add two quick things that you touched on, Barbara, that are really important in the messaging piece of this. One is that climate change is not something that's happening far away and only on these catastrophic, huge scale events. Like, we think of climate change, we think of the coral reefs dying and Australia burning, right? We don't think about we're losing a foot of marsh. You know, like it's harder for us to grasp that and to grapple with the significance of it when it's on that smaller, more localized scale sometimes. But it's really, really important, like you said, Barbara, to bring that home for folks, that this is happening right here, and there are things we can do to combat that. You know, so, and it's all connected. All these different projects are connected because nature is all connected. And the other thing that I wanted to say really quick is that there's one of the things that I have recognized is that there's a decoupling that needs to happen between sort of the value of an ecosystem and our use of it, and its value in our own lives. So it's easier, I think. It's also, forests are more visible. We're more, you know, we know trees better, so to speak, than we do wetland grasses and things like that. They're more intimate to us, most of us. But it's also like forests, we recognize as, okay, there's, you know, I can light my stove with wood. I can go take a walk in the woods and I feel restored by the presence of trees. I'm shaded by trees. All of this, there's all these benefits that are really relevant to our daily lives. And there needs to be a decoupling between the value of an ecosystem and its value to our human life, like in a daily sort of or economic context, right? Because there's no way to sort of pull wetlands out of the equation and see forests survive, right? So yeah, go ahead.
Hey, I just wanted to give a shout out to Barbara. She's one of our partners on a City Island, Oyster Reef, and those instruments I was talking about earlier for the nerds are going to deploy in support of that project down in the Western Sound. And go City Island. Yeah, and one way to really quickly think about it is look where the oil is. That's where the wetlands used to be. The Great Inland Sea, you know, out in Texas and Oklahoma. You look at the North Slope. I've been up in Barrow doing whale research, and it's nothing but wetland for miles and miles. And there's so much carbon stored there that the town of Barrow just poke pipes into the ground and the whole town gets free natural gas. I mean, these things are the carbon sinks. And that's why we have oil fields. Those were once wetlands a long time ago. So that's one way to look about it. And look at it. And I think it's definitely coming to the forefront, because we've lost the majority of our wetlands in this country already historically. And there's a question to that in the chat box by Mr. Griswold. And there's a lot of crops that get farmed and drained wetlands. You get the classic ones, the Everglades with the sugarcane and citrus. They ditch the 2/3 of the wetlands, which has changed the entire flow of that massive wetland down there by channelization. Soybeans, bottomland growing and soybeans, that's another one. Lots of duck habitat has been lost, especially in Louisiana and some of those other bottomland areas where they just ditched it. I have a ditched wetland on my property. I have a very old piece of farmland that I live in Killingworth, and they ditched around the wetlands here to grow blueberries. They probably had pasture at some time. You could see the ditches. So, I mean, every farmer looks as a wetland as a place where they can't make money, you know. So you're going to want, back in the day, a lot of farmers look at it differently now, because it supports pollinators and snakes to eat the rodents and whatever. But yeah, it's very common for many crops.
Out here, there's a lot of wheat, corn, hay. Those are, and they just, you kind of rotate those through. There's a lot of that out grown. I had lots of vegetables. I mean, the Snohomish in Skagit County, which Skagit's the county right next to Snohomish, it's huge agricultural, lots of farms, and then yeah, a lot of them used to be wetlands. But yeah, that's, I think hay, corn, wheat are kind of the main ones out here, and tulips. Now a lot of the farms are growing tulips.
And then they also grow people. If you know where Queens, New York is, that whole saddle between Long Island and Manhattan, that was a massive wetland that's been built on top of. A lot of it with oyster shell. So yeah, a lot of the historic, we have around on the East Coast, we have no idea of the scope of what used to be here.
All right, well, we have about 6 minutes left, and we have one more question in the chat that continues to play into the blue carbon concept. So Walden wants to know, was there any talk about developing blue carbon credits on the voluntary carbon market to help serve as an ongoing funding source for wetland restoration? It's an interesting question.
Yeah, this is something that we are exploring. And you can go to our website for blue carbon is just bluecarbon.us, really easy to remember. And we have some information about that. I'm not as familiar with that. I'm kind of more on the restoration side, but to get there, one of the things that we're doing is, before you can really, use blue carbon on the carbon market, you have to know how much carbon is restoring an estuary going to produce you. And so that's one of the things, that's kind of the side that we're working on primarily, is just doing studies all over. We're doing some down in Louisiana, up in the East Coast, and then out here in the Snohomish, really trying to get an answer to that question of how much carbon will you be able to trap. And I mean, in the Snohomish, they were able to make that into numbers. They said that the equivalent of 1.7 million cars off the road for a year. And that's 8.9 million tons of carbon captured over the next 100 years if you can restore the entire Snohomish Estuary. So I think just keep continuing to do the research to be able to get the numbers around and then turn that into dollars. But you can go to our website and there's some more information about the carbon market, and that's something we're starting to explore. It's very complicated and really hard to kind of get into, but we're looking into it because, I mean, that would be a great result, is to be able to then have money to be able to go back into restoration projects and have that cycle continue.
For sure. The last thing I'll say is that in a place that's as developed as Long Island Sound and in this region, another consideration that comes into play here is ownership of these marshes and the wetlands. So figuring out, not only where would the most high impact projects be, and what are those big opportunities for us to restore marshes, or to make way for them to migrate, which is something we haven't really talked about today. But marsh migration is one way of addressing this in the face of climate change. It's sort of providing space behind where the marshes currently are for them to actually migrate inland as water levels rise. So understanding where those projects would be most impactful is one step, but then there's always this step of okay, well, who owns and would need to give permission for this project to happen. And if you're lucky, it's owned by a municipality who's really avid about this stuff and is ready to go. I do think that perhaps carbon credits could help get private landowners on board. I don't know. It would depend on how those functioned and how they were traded. But yeah, it's another issue that we haven't really touched on today. But it's another way that the human aspect of this overlaps with our ability to restore marshes and wetlands.
And one last thing on that is that eutrophic systems like we have in Long Island Sound, due to poor water quality, they can become exporters of carbon. So you see all the sea lettuce and macroalgae and all the goo out there, that dies in a boom and bust carbon cycle. So instead of getting buried in a really nice constructed, like a natural wetland with roots and the proper species, if you have poor water quality, you're gonna have a eutrophic system and you're actually creating more carbon going out into the ocean. And then to put the pitch in also for seagrass beds, we haven't talked about that. They are also a carbon sink because they are designed also, especially in those protected areas where they can stay rooted away from the storms, they will also sequester and store, or fix, as some people call it, carbon. And we are working with one individual who has an interesting idea, and I'll leave you with this. It's being experimented with on the South Shore of Long Island, where he's figured out how to glue seeds on clams, and clams and seagrass have a symbiotic relationship. The clams will bury into the ground and create spaces and move nutrients for the seagrass to thrive. And he's inventing a machine that could put out tens of thousands of these things in a day. So when we start thinking about like restoring the entire Snohomish Estuary, we should also be thinking about restore the entire, what is possible if we do this? What if we have a technique and we clean up our water quality through the work that our water quality program is doing. They're mainly based out of New York. What if we could seed hundreds of acres of these seagrass and really increase that blue carbon sequestration? So that's sort of the vision I think everyone's going towards, and we have the ability to pull it off.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. It is just about 1 o'clock, so we're going to end here. I want to thank our panelists, especially Elsa, for joining us all the way from Washington State. So thank you. As it was alluded to at the end, we did not get to cover everything. It is impossible to cover everything that our environment and this natural world does for us in an hour. So I'm going to pop a link to our Stay Engaged page in the chat. That's where you can find all of our upcoming events. So please take a look. We're constantly adding webinars and panels like this for a variety of different topics. So I hope you join us for the next one.